I'm Dr. Crosby, and today we are going to talk about conscience. While our conscience is popularly depicted as an angel and a devil pulling us in two directions, the Christian understanding of conscience is actually a voice inside of us, a part of us, which always points us to what we believe to be the good. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't listen to our own conscience, and sometimes our conscience is wrong. Our discussion of Christian ethics must include the topic of conscience because the extent to which we fail to follow our conscience is the extent to which we have sinned. A sin is any act that harms or breaks our relationship with God and others. But a sin is not an accident. A sin only occurs when we have knowledge that our act is not for the good. How do we know? Our conscience. We have an obligation to follow our conscience because our conscience always represents what we believe to be the good. To choose to do something other than what our conscience tells us is to intentionally choose something that we believe is not good. That is a sin. I think that's straightforward enough until we remember that sometimes our conscience is wrong. Sometimes what we think is good is actually bad. Therefore, it is extremely important to the moral life to form our conscience properly. Not only do we need to be able to accurately recognize the good, we also need a conscience that is neither too strict nor too lax. Pope Francis describes a too strict conscience in The Joy of the Gospel. He writes, "More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving." A too strict conscience might become cowardly or hide behind rules which fail to respond to the complex circumstances in front of us. Martin Luther put it even more succinctly when he said, "Sin boldly." Our conscience can also be too lax. This might look like finding excuses for behaviors that we know are harmful. Despite the ways in which our conscience might go wrong, there is still a priority of conscience in the moral life. This means we are obligated to follow our conscience even when we have done a poor job of forming it. When we follow an erroneous conscience, our sin is not so much in the act committed, but in our negligence in forming our conscience. Sometimes, though, there isn't anything we could have done to form our conscience in a way that would have allowed us to see the good. These are cases of invincible ignorance. Ignorance means we don't know something, and invincible means undefeatable. So there is no way we could have overcome not knowing. When could something like this occur? Well, imagine you need to make an urgent, unexpected decision. It might be impossible for you to gather the information you would need to make a good decision. Or imagine a child. They don't have the development necessary to evaluate risk, which diminishes their moral responsibility. I put together a flowchart to help us see all these options laid out at once. This flowchart is only meant to help us understand how the concepts fit together. It is not to be used to judge your roommates or anyone else's behavior. Imagine you've just made a moral decision, and you are now trying to judge whether or not you've sinned. We begin by asking if you followed your conscience. Often, our feelings are a good indicator of this. If you have a pit in your stomach or a lump in your throat, that's a good indicator that you went against your conscience. A word of caution, though. Your conscience ultimately resides in your rationality, your ability to reason, not in your emotional self. Sometimes how we feel is a bad indicator. For example, sometimes we feel guilty even when we know rationally that we did the right thing. If you did not follow your conscience, you intentionally chose what you believed to be bad, and therefore you sinned. If you did follow your conscience, we have a few more questions to ask. First, is your conscience in alignment with Catholic Church teaching? The priority of conscience does not free you from rules and norms. The Catholic Church has clear teachings about many moral issues which should be informing your conscience. This should actually be comforting. It means you don't have to figure out everything all by yourself. Smart people have been thinking about moral issues for hundreds of years and are giving you their well thought out conclusions. If your conscience agrees with the Catholic Church's teaching, you can feel confident that your conscience correctly identified the good and you did not sin. Sometimes your conscience might not agree with Catholic Church teaching, or you might not know what the Catholic Church teaches, or you might be facing an issue that the Catholic Church hasn't said anything specific about. Then you must ask if there is anything more you could have done to form your conscience. Have you researched what the Catholic Church teaches, and even more importantly, why? Do you understand the arguments? Is there additional research you could do about the issue? For example, if you're thinking about divesting from fossil fuels, do you know what that means, what the alternatives are, and what the consequences are likely to be? Have you prayed about it? Have you talked to trusted, virtuous friends, family members, or religious leaders? We don't always have a lot of time to make moral decisions, so it is important to become knowledgeable about your faith tradition and cultivate a life of virtue so that you'll be prepared. If you've done all you could to form your conscience, you haven't sinned, even if it ultimately turns out you made the wrong decision. If there's more you could have done, your sin was related more to negligence in forming your conscience than in the act itself. Let's try a couple examples. Josh loves to watch football. His favorite team is the Patriots, and they are playing in the Super Bowl this Sunday. However, for the past few years, Josh has had a nagging feeling that maybe watching football is immoral. He always knew that football was dangerous, but now he knows that it can cause irreparable brain damage, known as CTE. Can he justify watching a sport that leads to memory loss, depression, and sometimes suicide? He decides to watch the game on TV with friends like he always does. While we can't always rely on feelings, it seems Josh has made a rational argument in his head for why watching football is wrong. So he did not follow his conscience. Interestingly, this may not have been a sin for his friends whose consciences were formed differently. Here's another example. Jane recently read an article in a magazine about how plastic in oceans affects fish. It said that some people have stopped using straws to cut down on single-use plastic, but it also said almost half of the microplastics in the ocean come from fishing nets. Consequently, Jane thinks this is a problem that doesn't have much to do with her. She's Eastern Orthodox, but she doesn't think her faith tradition would have anything to say about microplastics. In this case, Jane has followed her conscience, but she hasn't done enough work to form her conscience. She doesn't know what her faith tradition would say. If she did some more research, she would find that Eastern Orthodox leader Patriarch Bartholomew has said, "For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life, these are sins. For to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God." If you're Catholic, the same applies to you. Pope Francis quotes this passage from Patriarch Bartholomew in his social encyclical Laudato Si. This doesn't necessarily give an easy answer to the question about plastic straws, but it will help form our conscience in the right direction. The 7 principles of Catholic social teaching are a great place to start in forming one's conscience. When these principles are broken, we have likely not chosen the good. However, since these principles deal with social issues, they are rarely broken by one individual person. It's not your fault personally that adjunct professors are underpaid, and many universities have been resistant to allowing them to unionize. But just by being a student at a university, you are complicit in that sin. You participate in a sinful structure and benefit from it. That is called social sin. It's sin that comes in the form of a sinful system that we all participate in, although we didn't choose it, and it's not our fault that the system exists. Social sin is troubling because we feel stuck in it, even when we don't want it. But it is possible to change sinful structures by informing our community conscience. To inform our community conscience, we need to pay attention to who has been invited to our community discussions. To use my earlier example, if we don't invite adjuncts into our university discussions, we are unlikely to understand their plight. When we have a well-formed community conscience, we will be motivated to work for justice and change the sinful structures we find ourselves caught up in.